Dear Mr. Friedman, we are honored and thrilled at BOZAR that you could spare some time to share your thoughts on the world of today with us here in Europe. And this interview fits in the framework of what we call Europe Day. The 9th of May, the European Union remembers the Schuman Declaration, which is considered the beginning of the European project. But we, of course, can't talk about Europe if we don't talk about the United States. Your work as a writer and journalist and columnist for the New York Times, I think I don't exaggerate that you're one of the most influential thinkers of our time. So who better could we ask to shed a light on this situation in the world today? So first of all, I would like to talk a bit about this situation in the United States that we have been following anxiously the last 4 years, I must say. And the situation has changed, of course, since the election of Joe Biden as a president. And could you tell us, how do you look back on the 4 years that Donald Trump occupied the White House, in maybe two senses of the word, if I may say so?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be with your audience and with friends in Europe. And I'm a big EU fan. I may be the only EU fan in America. I'm not sure. So it's great to be with you. You know, let me start at 30,000 feet. You know, that America is going through a convergence of two trends right now. So the first is a socio-cultural trend, demographic trend as well. We are going from a white majority country to a minority majority country. Sometime in the 2040s, if demographic projections play out, Black, brown, Asian, mixed race will be the dominant segment of the American population. Something I embrace, I welcome, but it's something that is unnerving for some of my fellow Americans. So we're going through a huge cultural shift, and we're in the middle of it right now. At the same time, technologically, we're in another shift. The technology is enabling individuals, companies, cable sites, news sites, to do something we've never had before, to make big profits from dividing and disinforming people.
Yeah.
You can now get very rich in America by dividing people and by disinforming them with conspiracy theories, lies, etc. I speak to you literally a day after it was revealed that the New York Post, a very popular New York newspaper, ran a story that went everywhere that said that basically Vice President Kamala Harris was forcing people to buy or selling her book to refugees, and they were showing up in refugee centers in America. And the reporter who wrote that story, who just quit, said something very interesting. She said, I quit because I was forced to write that story. I was forced to write that story. So we now have a business model that says you can get rich or powerful politically from dividing and disinforming people in the middle of a giant social transformation, in the middle of a pandemic. And that's where we are today. And that can produce some very aberrant, disturbing political trends. And one of them was the Trump presidency.
Was it then a surprise that Biden won the election? Because when I hear you, it's not a good time for someone who is let's say, preaching solidarity and more moderate political views.
Well, let's remember he won basically by 100,000 votes, spread between 14 states. Yeah. You know, in a country where I think there was 160 or 170 million votes cast. So when the morning after the election, I wrote a column in which I said, I feel like I was watching Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, crossing an intersection in New York. And suddenly a guy driving a bus with a bunch of crazy people in the back ran the red light And she jumped out of the way at the last second. And now she's sitting on the curb. Her heart is pumping. Oh my God, that was close. But the driver and that bus are still out there, and the people in the back are applauding. So yes, Biden won. He won narrowly. There's still a narrow majority in this country for sanity, for pluralism, for the rule of law and democracy. But have no doubt, Lady Liberty is sitting on the curb. Her heart is pounding, and the bus driver and some of his worst passengers are still circling the neighborhood.
Biden has not missed his start. He's taking measures in a very strict tempo that's were deemed unthinkable even a few months ago.
Yeah.
The Green Deal on climate, stimulus package that is much bigger than the European ones. He's turning back on the tax breaks that Trump gave, but also imposing new taxes and fighting. His finance minister is fighting or wanting to fight the tax havens all over the world. This is a policy that let's say a social democratic policy that was not common in the United States, but even not in Europe. In many, the mainstream was, if you compare that to the way that Greece was treated by the European Union a few years ago, yeah, it's completely different. At least that should come as a surprise to you, or did you expect also that to happen?
Yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised, but not shocked, because I supported President Biden and I know him. You know that he's really, gone for the max. He's understood I've got a narrow time, and I'm going to absolutely aim high and really go for the max. That said, we have to distinguish between aspiration and implementation. Yeah. And he got through the original stimulus, 1.9 trillion. Now they're looking for infrastructure and big climate spending, and he's made big aspirational goals, which I admire, but they still have to go through the legislative meat grinder to be translated into reality. And I think we should.
The clock is ticking because his majority is only certain for 2 years to have the majority.
Exactly. So he's got to get a lot done fast.
And to go back to the international scene, there is a lot of concern. The tensions are rising with Russia, and there is this, and also with China. Trump didn't start a war during his presidency, but do you think that Biden will do it or be forced to do it? I don't know how to put it.
Again, let's go to 30,000 feet. I've been witness to 3 broad phases in international relations. I was born in the Cold War, global bipolar competition between communism and democracy. I then got to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall and the 25 years of the long peace, really 1989 to sort of 2015, where we had really no major, certainly big power conflict. There were minor ones and things like 9/11, but there were no major global wars. It was a very long peace. Now we're entering a third phase. I would argue in this third phase where, and I wrote about this this morning, I wrote about my friend Michael Mandelbaum's book, The End of Peace on Earth. We're in this third phase now where these 3 ancient, in some ways, powers with a deep legacy of dominating their neighborhood, China, Russia, and Iran, are all becoming rather aggressively nationalistic. And I think that's due in part to that for the first 25 years of the long peace, they were able to sort of buy their population support with steadily rising economic growth. But as that has flattened out, these governments, Iran, Russia, and China, they actually fear democracy, sometimes more than we realize. Mm-hmm. And the rising growth, that kind of bought off a lot of that tension. But now the growth is not there. I think what you're seeing all 3 do in their own way is shift to a kind of aggressive nationalism in order to deflect these internal pressures that they have. each one in their own way. Now, I think America is pretty capable with its allies of balancing Russia and Iran. I'm not particularly worried about that. But China is a whole nother question. China is well on its way to becoming the world's biggest market, biggest economy, and maybe the most powerful country. And there's only not our economic peer, but technological peer. As I've been writing, there's only one place where China is not our peer technologically, but it's a very important one. And that's in semiconductors, microchips. China has been unable to master the physics and nanotechnology to make the most advanced logic chips that are the foundation of artificial intelligence, machine learning, high performance computing, and the whole digital economy going into. China's not been able to do that. And a lot of the struggle going forward, because Trump began and Biden is continuing, that we have begun to deny China access to those microchips, which we can do because they're either made in Taiwan by companies that, like TSMC, that use American manufacturing technology, or they're made in America. And I think you're going to see a lot of the war focusing on this question of microprocessors, because they're the foundation of AI, and AI is going to be the foundation of everything, including weapon systems. And so that's where a lot of the struggle is going to focus in the near future.
Does this also mean that the fear for China will eventually bring Europe and the United States back together again, and also NATO, give NATO a new reason for existence?
Well, it's a very good question, Karl. I believe that the Cold War was fought and won in Berlin, basically. And I believe the Cold War between China and America will be fought and won in Berlin. That is, as Berlin goes, so goes the EU. And as the EU goes, whether it's leaning more toward China or leaning more toward America, will really determine a lot about the competition between those two superpowers. So I think Europe is going to be a pivotal player here. And what I tell Americans is do not be smug and certain that the EU will always side with us against China. If you're a Belgian company and you're looking at a Chinese market of 1.4 billion consumers, and you're looking at an American economy that's a quarter that size, you simply cannot afford to ignore them, you know. And so it's going to be, Europe's going to be really stressed in this new phase of foreign policy.
You said you are an admirer or a fan of the European Union. Could you explain why? Which arguments do you use to convince your fellow Americans that the European project is something that we should desire and not ridicule?
Well, Americans will do anything for the EU except read about it. Okay, so they really don't understand it. And I once did a column about the EU, and to get people to read about it, I tried to fool the search engine by calling it Trump's EU, because if Trump's name was in the headline, it would get people to find it on the search engine. Look, the EU is so important to me for several reasons. The first goes back, which most Americans have forgotten about, to the original reason, you know, the European, Coal and Steel Commission was formed. And it was not just economic. It was to create bonds of solidarity in Europe after World War II, which not only ripped apart Europe, but drew America across the ocean into a world war. So to the extent that the EU remains a vital source of solidarity for Europe and a buffer against any stresses and strains of European nationalism tipping over into the kind of aggressive nationalism that led us into World War I and World War II, the EU is hugely important. But beyond that, the EU is the other great global center of free markets, free ideas, and free people. And it's the United States of Europe in its own way. And I have a simple rule in life: 2 United States are better than 1. Okay, 2 giant centers promoting democracy, liberal ideas, religious pluralism, academic freedom, empowerment of women and minorities, that's hugely important.
Mhm.
And because I lived abroad, I actually saw the EU in action. I saw the EU from the roads where the sign in Ireland said this road built by the European Union, or in rural Spain, to the West Bank, to the NGO there that does polling in the West Bank that is funded by the European Union. So I understand the European Union is a huge, and I don't mean this in a arrogant way, but it's a huge amplifier of American power and values at their best, when we're at our best. The EU is a huge amplifier. And so I wish it a long life and great health.
I'm a big fan of science fiction movies, and when the planet is threatened by aliens, all the nations of the world come together to fight the aliens in the films like Independence Day.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now we're going to the climate crisis. We have the pandemic, which didn't bring us closer together, I think, on the contrary. But the climate change can only be won together if China, Europe, and the United States work together. Could that be a trigger to maybe soften the relationship between the three blocks of power, or is that naive for me to think that?
Well, one thing I've learned over the years is that it takes a huge threat for people to overcome their tribalism. And I mean, literally a hurricane to the head, I mean, yep. Either you cooperate, the three of you cooperate, or this hurricane is going to level you. I mean, literally it's right there and it's coming, it takes that much to overcome, a lot of
aliens must be landing.
You have to actually see the aliens. You have to actually hear them knocking at your door. Yeah. Oh, honey, I think there's some aliens at the door. I better call China. It really will take that.
Yeah, but this climate action we have to take, it's a responsibility, let's say, of the north, of the richer countries that are polluting the most. The industry is changing, of course, but on the other hand, there is this enormous financialization of the economy. The economy is completely becoming a virtual game of the stock exchange that is not connected anymore with the real economy, which leads to a sort of what you see was happening now with the Bitcoin craze. I'm afraid sometimes that even politicians, we vote for politicians, but what do they have in their power to really bring this economic system back to a position where it serves the people instead of we all serving the economy? That's a bit.
Well, there are a lot of questions in there, so let me just take the first one about climate and what is the obligation of, the wealthy countries. I wrote about this. I wrote a book back in 2008 called Hot, Flat, and Crowded, in which I proposed something called a Green New Deal. So this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I take a very, my view of climate, like I'm all for Paris and all these things and people taking on obligations or claiming to, but there's something I learned a long time ago about climate and energy. That climate and energy, these are scale problems. Yeah. And if you don't have scale when you're trying to take on the climate change, you have a hobby. I like hobbies. I used to build model airplanes, okay? But I wouldn't try to change the climate as a hobby. Now, there's only one thing as big or bigger as Mother Nature, and that's Father Greed, the marketplace, okay? So there's really only, in my view, one thing to focus on. How do I shape the marketplace through taxes, standards, and regulations to get it to produce for profit what I want? Because that's basically what the oil companies and coal companies did, shape the market with certain standards, regulations, and tax incentives to produce what they wanted, which was cheap fossil fuel energy that emitted enormous carbon. So that's really my only focus, frankly. How do I reshape the American market? Because my view, and this isn't jingoism, it's just my view, that if America goes green, the whole world goes green. We will tip everything, and if we don't,
but it comes back to legislation. Then you have
exactly. So that's all I focus on. So I'm all for Paris and all these meetings, but What I'm focused on is what is going to change the incentives in the American market so American business and industry will produce the green tools, power systems, energy efficiency, transportation, and power generation for clean green energy. And once we do that, that'll go all over the world. It also drive costs down the cost volume curve so people in the developing world can afford them. That's our moral obligation. Our moral obligation not to give them money, because a lot of times they come to us and say, either give me money or I'll kill all my trees. Oh, wait a minute. I mean, that's not going to work. Okay. Our obligation is to use our money, our tax dollars, our standards and regulations to drive all these clean green technologies and efficiency systems down the cost volume curve. So a country like India in this poorest village can say, we can afford that. And we get the benefits of clean. So that's my focus and my strategy. I
wanted to avoid the conversation, to go to conversation to talk about the COVID crisis, but of course it's inevitable. We're all sick and tired of what's happening, and it's appalling to see. In the United States, things are going much better since the vaccination campaign is going stronger than in Europe, and certainly than in India. But let's hope that this pandemic will be over later this year. Will the world go back to business as usual? Is it possible to go back to business as usual, or did we learn something from it that forces us to change a few minor or big things that we were used to?
Well, I sure hope we don't go back to business as usual regarding dimensions of the pandemic, because that's what got us into this problem. Early on in the pandemic, my daughter works for National Public Radio. She actually is the executive producer of All Things Considered Weekend Edition, and so I never miss a show. Mm-hmm. And back a year ago, April, on Easter Sunday, mm-hmm. they did a gathering, a roundup of sermons that different pastors gave at different churches all over America on Easter Sunday, mm-hmm. really at the height of the pandemic. And my favorite was a pastor here at National Cathedral who ended his Easter sermon by singing a little song. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. Now you just substitute she for he, she being Mother Nature. And what we learned in the pandemic, and we learned this about once a century, she got the whole world in her hands. And this was the first time
you don't mess with her. No.
That Mother Nature had all of us. We were all in the grip of Mother Nature at the same time. And what we were all exposed to was basically the iron law of nature, which is that Mother Nature throws challenges. In American baseball terms, we say fastballs at her species, plants and animals, to see who will get their DNA into the next generation. And these fastballs are called droughts and floods and freezes and heat waves and germs and viruses. Okay, even though viruses are actually other living things themselves, but when they invade us, they become a challenge. And she just sits back and says, who's up to this? Okay, and the question she asks is not who's the strongest. The question she asks is not who's the smartest. No, the question she asks, which Darwin taught us a long time ago, is who's the most adaptive? Yeah. Who can adapt best to my virus?
Who's the fittest?
And she asked basically three questions about your adaptation strategy. The first is, are you humble? Are you humble? Do you respect my virus? Because if you don't, it will kill you or someone you love. And frankly, a lot of us weren't humble. Second, she asks, are you coordinated in your response to my virus? Because I've evolved my virus over millennia to find any crack in your individual or collective immune system. Are you coordinated? We weren't coordinated. And lastly, she asked, have you built your adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics? Because that's all I am, says Mother Nature. I'm just chemistry, biology, and physics. You can't talk me up. You can't talk me down. You can't say, hey, Mother Nature, we're having a bad recession. Could you take a few months off? No, I'm going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And I always bat last. And I always bat 1,000. Do not mess with me. Now, if you build your adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics, you'll be okay. But if you build it on politics, ideology, and an election calendar, you will not be okay. She will hurt you or someone you love. And that tension was present from the beginning of the pandemic. Some of us were humble, some weren't. Some were coordinated, some weren't. And some built their adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics, and some didn't. And everything else is just commentary.
I work for a cultural institution, so I'm obliged to ask you a question about, can artists or art or culture help politicians or people who are whose work it is to govern the world, help them to be inspired to achieve a world that's more equitable, and more livable, or is art just a pastime for people with a lot of time, free time?
Oh my gosh! I mean, we need artists. We need painters and photographers and songwriters and literature writers more than ever. Because when they're at their best, they really are people who can heal. They're people who can illuminate, and they're people who can unify. We can come together around art in different ways. We can be illuminated by it in ways that no politician or teacher can do. And Lord knows we can be inspired by the greatest literature and music and painting.
Is there an artist that gets you through the bad days, you personally?
You know, no. I mean, look, I have my favorite songwriters and people like Paul Simon, you know, whatever. But, you know, my wife just built a museum in Washington to promote reading, literature, and love of language. It's called Planet Word. You can find it at planetwordmuseum.org. It's the most amazing thing you have ever seen. It's going to be the most popular museum in Washington, D.C. And it's all there to inspire love of words, reading, and language.
Great.
And on the assumption, on the philosophical position that without a literate society, without a society of readers, we will not be able to maintain our democracy.
Okay, Mr. Friedman, that was a wonderful way to end this conversation. I wish you very good luck and good health.
My pleasure, Karl. Good luck with your program. I hope this works. And
bye.
Take care, Karl. Bye-bye.
See you later.